Hi, everybody. I'm Ralph Benmergy, and this is Not That Kind of Rabbi. I don't remember what number or episode this one is, but we've done a few. We've done it. We're getting close to 60, I think, and that's a good thing. I'm very happy to do this. I love exploring the spiritual life with different people, and the way we, as Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi, one of my teachers, always said, you're always trying to figure out how somebody gets it on with God. So really, that's kind of what we're doing. And by that word God, I've wanted to write a book called God is a 4-letter word. Because if you want to buzzkill at a dinner party, just say God. And all of a sudden, I've had all kinds of reactions. My favorite reaction was from Richard Dawkins, who is an avowed atheist and gained a lot of notoriety and popularity in, I think it would be the late 90s, early 2000s. For some of his writings, him and Hitchens and a few others. And I was invited by the Toronto publisher of his book, because he was on a book tour, to a dinner that a bunch of us could go to. And I thought, well, sure, that's cool. And I ended up sitting beside him. And I don't know how we got there, but his question to me was, you actually believe these fairy tales? And I said, I felt insulted just as a person, not because I'm the holder of some great truth. And I said, well, you can see them as fairy tales. I tend to see a lot of the scriptures as metaphorical, internal and inner journeys. So, for the example I would give would be, try to get Yul Brynner out of your head while I say this, but Pharaoh in the Exodus story is the tyrant who will not set them free. He hardens his heart over and over again. To me, Pharaoh is not the historical figure of Ramses II. It is the internal tyrant, the one that doesn't want us to be free. And the other interesting part is when the Israelites, i.e. you or me, are freed, we're really bad at it, like really bad at it. We want to go back to slavery as quickly as we possibly can. Give me structure, right? At least I get 3 a day. So I tried to kind of explain a little bit of this to him, and he just looked at me like I was just poor, like he had pity. I could feel the pity in his eyes as he looked at me, of you poor, innocent soul, you naive soul. I don't even think he'd use the word soul. But what I felt at that moment was, everything can be a dogma. Everything can be ideological, and including, I do work as a spiritual director, and if people want that kind of counseling, they come to me, and usually through my Gmail account, my Ralph Benmergy at Gmail, and I get different clients. But sometimes I get a client, not that often, but every once in a while I get one who insists to tell me at the very beginning, look, I don't believe in God, okay? Like, we have to start there. And what in the spiritual counseling world, the answer is, well, tell me about the God you don't believe in.
Yeah.
Right? So we end up with a God who usually is a white guy with a beard, older than me, but not by much, on a really nice chair, who has a naughty and nice list. That's Santa Claus. So God, for some people, a book I would suggest to some people as an interesting exploration of this through Jewish mysticism is God is a Verb by Rabbi David Cooper. It's a really interesting read because it's let's get out of this idea that God is a noun, a person, a thing that you can, go and give a hug to. I tend to think of it cosmologically. Matthew Fox does a lot of writing on creation spirituality. And if you think about the idea, for instance, that there are 9 billion trillion stars estimated in the universe, then you can let go of this idea that there's this guy who's really worried about how you're doing today. And sort of go back into what we refer to in Hebrew as yirah, or awe. And without awe, which is often written as fear in the scriptures, the fear of God, which does not mean you're afraid. It means you have the sense to know that you're just a small molecule in the body of creation. And you should know your place. There's humility in that. Quickest example of that is here in Hamilton, where I live. There are about 17 different waterfalls that you can walk to on trails. Every summer, there are a few people, God love them, who decide they're better than the waterfall. So they stand at the very lip of it with the water rushing over to get a nice picture from their friends. And then they slip. And then they fall 15 feet. And, some of them get very badly injured. But it's because they don't have an appropriate amount of fear. You don't stand on a rock 57 yards out into the ocean with the waves coming in to say, take a picture. The ocean will kill you. So know your place, know your humility, but also know that sometimes your humility should lead you to take a leadership position, to be proactive. It's not about, oh, humble little me, don't mind me. It's knowing the appropriate place to put yourself in those things. So those are some thoughts that come to me, mostly through my clients, by the way, who inspire me all the time with the things they say and make me have to think about these things as well. So today I want to talk to somebody, the Reverend Peter Woods, who is a member of the United Church of Canada, a saxophonist or a saxophonist, you can pick which one you want to say there, who has found a way to lead a congregation, play his music, and find the embodiment of spiritual life in that. And I wanted to explore that. So Reverend Woods, thank you for being here. How are you doing?
I'm well. Thanks a lot, Ralph, for having me today.
No problem. A mutual friend of ours said, you got to talk to this guy. I said, why? And he said, because he knows how to put music into spirit and spirit into music. So give me a bit of a journey. How did you find yourself with a horn in your hand, in one hand, and a Bible in the other?
Thanks. Yeah. Well, I've been doing that. I guess I've been 32 years in ordained ministry in the United Church of Canada, served 3 different congregations around Canada, rural New Brunswick on the Bay of Fundy, small town Ontario, and currently I'm at Mackay United Church here in Ottawa. I'm actually right across from the Governor General's residence, and today the big news, of course, across the country is the announcement of the new Governor General. So she's actually, I guess, going to be a neighbor, which is pretty cool. I've played music my whole life. Started out in stage band and Nepean High School in Ottawa years ago, and I think right from the beginning of my musical journey, I just knew that music was the language that actually spoke to my spirituality, whatever that felt like it was at 13 or 11. But right from really early, I didn't even understand what I was hearing or knowing or being led into. But I've always, the metaphors around music or conversations around music, or certainly the performance of music, has always been the place where I've sensed spirit, connectiveness. Also, what you said earlier, like the breakdown of language. I think it's really important for me to break down language and understand that my language, my dogma, doesn't get the job done. It doesn't serve my own sense of identity as a spiritual person.
Tell me more about
that. Just like the creeds. I mean, the hymns we sing. When you were talking earlier about language, I think about these really problematic lyrics in Jesus, keep me near the cross, that are harsh often, or can be read to be harsh, and the music does another thing in a nonverbal realm, and as a word guy, as a guy who sort of wrestles back and forth between word and sound, I find myself dismissing certain conventions or truths or orthodoxies in my own faith, and sometimes with good reason. I think the sort of some of the sort of nonsense that Christian orthodoxy has promoted or just sort of rested in for centuries. So I think standing and saying, putting a big question mark beside some of it is really important. But often there's this other thread that has been going through the whole thing. This spiritual, spirit-filled thread of energy, beauty, of awe, and the delivery system of Orthodox Christianity and perhaps other Orthodox faith traditions have sometimes limited that wild spirit, and somehow getting a saxophone going at a jam session or in church with an organ or it's just playing has always been my way of kind of fostering or keeping that other energy going in my own life.
When you were saying that just now, I was thinking jazz is interesting for the way you're thinking, because you don't just start improvising. You don't just start with jazz. You have to have your structure. You have to have your basics and your fundamentals, and there are rules to music, right?
Amen. Yep. Yeah. And getting to know those rules is such an endless and wonderful journey. I've been mentored by so many, both elders and younger folks along the way to just work on that craft. And I mean, I love that craft, and I love realizing how little I know when I think I know. I mean, you learn a 12-bar blues at one level, and then you learn it at another level, and it just never, something as defined as that just becomes a world of endless mystery, which, I mean, not hard to make a leap from there to a preaching, moment. Or prayer.
There are scriptures, but then there has to be a certain moment of interpretation. I'm sure Jaco Pastorius, the legendary jazz bass player, did the 12-bar blues, but when you hear him on a 5-string bass, with a flange, just making these sounds that are just otherworldly, then he has transcended the craft and created the spirit, right?
Yeah. Yes. And I think that was there, right? I think that's been there throughout the entire history of jazz. I mean, obviously it's been with so many of those heavy players, but just that idea of improvising on something familiar right away, you're on holy ground. I'm hearing something I know, like the blues, and then I'm just hearing wisdom and history and prophecy. I got lots of deep dives on characters, but Charles Lloyd is one of the people I keep going back to in the last 20 years or so. And just because he's so articulate about that, about going back to folk songs and simple structures and letting those simple structures just expand out into he's very hip spiritually. So, he would talk about them becoming prayers and becoming even healing energies through performance.
I was just thinking some original jazz for me would be the Gregorian chant. Right? I always thought, man, these guys, like, they have this whole monastic life. And in Judaism, there is no monastic life, but this whole monastic life. And then they stand there, and within a 3 to 4 note range, they go for 2 hours.
Yeah.
Like this, and I just think that's embodied spirituality. That's not in the head. What does the scripture mean? Forget it. Just start this singing, and that's what the scripture means, right?
And sometimes, yeah, I think absolutely. And sometimes just the little phrases that are lifted up from scripture.
Like what?
Jesus wept. If
what do you hear when you hear Jesus wept? Because it's also a mild kind of curse, in Newfoundland. Oh, Jesus wept.
Right. Yeah.
I've never really understood. Like, I've never gotten to sink into it. What does it mean to you?
I empathy. I think identification. Just the line between whatever makes that character in the Gospels important, but the line is blurred. I'm empathizing. Jesus is empathizing with Lazarus in that moment, but empathizing with the moment, entering into the embodied moment with his tears and being very extraordinarily present. I think that's where I get to.
So when you're doing a sermon, is it a tougher road to hoe than to bring out the horn and just start playing?
Yeah. I've found over the years, I've tried to practice that, what I've learned on the horn, in my preparation for sermons. And that's been tough because there's such a legacy around sermons where that's that guy up there or over there saying these words that are somehow important and true in that moment, for at least for him or her. But for us to when I play jazz, I'm so aware of the tradition. I'm so aware of being mentored and being almost disciplined by the craft. And I yearn for that in my preaching and my homiletics, and it's been harder to cultivate that for me.
Wow.
I've learned. I think my speaking in church is very much. I will take a very simple story from Hebrew or Christian scriptures and try to stay with that story for a little while and see where the resonance in that story is for me and for the community in this moment. And sometimes that's about all I do. That's the sermon is just sort of pointing out the resonance of that story. Sometimes I guess I'm a little self-critical after all these years. It feels like it's not enough sometimes. But I think when I step back from it, I know that that's actually congruent with most of what I know about how faith and intellect and this moment in a post-Christian or post-Christendom era, that's as good as it's going to get.
Judaism is having an issue itself with what's a post-rational Judaism, because Judaism went through a real last few hundred years of rational Judaism. And there's an interesting way to see it, a very simplified version of what Kabbalah can talk about, the Jewish mysticism, is that there are four worlds we live in, all of us. And the first is the body, the second is the heart, the third is the mind, and the fourth is the spirit. And all of us tend to inhabit some of these places more than others, right? So when the clergy gets up and parses the words of Scripture, so in the Jewish tradition, they'll say, well, the 3-letter root of the Hebrew word for rock is water, and the water, and there are people who are very interested in this during the service, but there are other people who are yearning for a holy listening, a heart-to-heart kind of interchange. And I wonder if it's music that's missing at that moment in time, because we sing together. And yet, if I interrupted anyone in the middle of a Jewish prayer, the vast majority of them might say, what are you actually saying right now? Do you know? As if it seemed as if you were doing a Latin prayer. And they say, no. Why are you doing it? Because we're singing together. It's like scat.
Right.
Right? It's just, we're singing, you can call it gibberish, whatever you want, but we're singing a sacred language together. And I always lamented the Christians' loss of the idea of Latin as the lingua franca of church, right?
Right.
In the United Church, I used to, 40 years ago, I was doing stand-up comedy, and I'd occasionally look into the audience and I'd say, how were you brought up? And somebody would say, United. And I go, oh, nothing. And everyone would laugh.
Right.
And then I said, no offense. It's just, the guitar comes out and it's the whole thing. And what I really meant was, you're of the dominant culture, so you can afford to say nothing. You
Yep.
could say, right? In Israel, if you're Jewish, you don't have to work at it. It's everywhere. It's all around.
Right.
In Canada, if you're Christian, you don't have to work at it. So
Exactly.
how do you engage? How do you in what you're calling a post-Christian world, how do you send your message into the heart of another person?
Your comments sparked a couple of thoughts about decentering, one of the big words these days, but is just the ways in which we are have been decentered in a wonderful way. I mean, I'm thrilled to be doing what I'm doing in this moment as a clergy person, and I'm really so pleased to have this sort of all these jazz metaphors and practices in the back of my head when I come to this moment, because especially as a white male clergy person in the dominant culture, Protestantism, like there's so many ways that you're just, it's so boring, frankly, apart from being not very, not very hard to be prophetic. That's for sure. One of my formative experiences was back in the early 1980s. I found myself working in El Salvador, and worked through a friend of a friend, ended up working as a translator for the mothers of the disappeared. And they, at that point, were an incredible force. And this was in the 84, so the war was hot. Romero has only been dead a few years, and the mothers of the disappeared were doing this piece of work where they would bring foreign groups, mostly Christians, a lot of European Christian groups, and they would tell their story. And part of their story involved, and I would be translating. I was the person in the room. Anyways, I was translating, I was 21-year-old Canadian guy. And I was in this wonderful, incredibly powerful gift. I mean, because these women were prophets, and their message was to tell the story of how their kid had gone missing, and sometimes they found the body and often never found the body. And they would tell the story, and they would hold up the picture of their child, now gone, disappeared. And then they would tell the story of what happened to them in their protests. And that usually meant at some point actually disrobing and showing where they've been wounded in torture. And I mean, so I was translating this, and I to my mind, I don't think I've ever, that's remained as the paradigm for how I understand my vocation. I think I just finished my undergrad at that point. I hadn't been involved in ministry at all, but somehow to be in that space, and for whatever reason, to be given the task of trust, in that case, to translate the story in that moment. I mean, and not feeling like I was looking back, there was, I was way beyond, I was way out of my depth. But it was a wonderful, crystal clear moment of you translate you pay attention to the reality in which you are finding yourself, and somehow translate that reality into words or
so
thoughts.
You become for los madres de los desaparecidos, you become the conduit. You become, and for a congregation, I guess, it's interesting because from what I understand in palliative care, Christians as the patient do better than Jews, because in the simplest terms, there's a middleman. You can talk to Jesus, right? And you've always grown up with these iconic images of Jesus and Mary, but in Judaism, it's unknowable. God is the complete unknowable. So how do you talk to the unknowable is harder than Jesus, I'm coming. Right? So there's a lot of power in that. And to hear the story, and in essence, I guess, from these women, the prayer for their lost child, for their lost soul, and then to actually be the person who says, this is what they're telling you. This is how this is what their experience is, and having no choice but to feel it at that point.
Right.
That's very powerful. It's very powerful. But now when you get up in front of a group, there is, I just worked with a group of Presbyterian ministers and to facilitate a conversation about post-COVID, what do we do with this place, which was already in trouble, where attendance was down, where monies are not coming in. Is there such a thing as a post-congregational or a post-institutional spirituality? And if so, where does the clergy fit into that? And I'm sure you've had lots of conversations about that. But with your saxophone in hand, how do you respond to that kind of a situation?
Play more. Definitely. We haven't figured that out. We're looking at a reopening strategies and having all those conversations. With my saxophone, I think we've known for a while, but actually being online for worship and we do a Sunday morning event online, and we do a weekly music and meditation, which is kind of part of my project around jazz and spirituality. And one of the things we've been able to do, partly because we have a sound technician in the room. If I'm live in a church and start talking and somebody starts playing music, it's like, hey, wait a second, you're too loud, or I can't hear myself think, or there's problems because we're just nothing too fancy in terms of sound in the building. But online, we've really worked at this craft, and one of the outcomes has been we can do a thing with music and even saxophone and boost the voice and have a prayer time and have all sorts of music padding the worship service in a sort of newly integrated way. And it's always been there. Lots of churches, famously the African American churches have been doing this forever. I went to Al Green's church in Memphis years ago, and his organist was running that service, just playing all the hits through the service. But and
Leslie and the Hammond B3 and just
yeah. But it's we sort of stumbled into this recently and realized, man, people are just. We had our big annual meeting and a lot of talk about budget and a lot of talk about the future. And at the end, it was all on Zoom. And at the end, the pianist here and myself just had a little quiet time and offered a bit of a litany of concerns in a prayerful kind of way. But the piano was playing the whole time, and people, we got so much love and feedback from doing it in that format. And all those elements have always been there. We've just integrated them. So I think that's things like that will happen more and more. Our music and meditation event here at Mackay Church was, in Ottawa, was getting a bunch of people walking in to listen and meditate and maybe do yoga during our offerings on Tuesday evenings live. Now that we're doing it online, and we'll continue to do it online whenever we open the doors, our last bunch of offerings, there's a church in Edmonton that use it as a community building part of their week, is to go to our thing and have I think sometimes they just have happy hour, but they hang out with this thing that we're doing live in Ottawa. And so, there's a lot of talk about ways that we are on the edge of stuff we've kind of dreamt of for some time, some flexibility, some getting out of the box. I think most of us clergy and having a saxophone and going off, I play gigs all over town, and then I come back to church, and I love church, but sometimes it's felt like two separate worlds a little bit, and much less so now.
So that's one of the blessings of all this, right?
Yeah.
Innovation comes with
congregations, I think, are seeing that their potential right now. I could never, I don't think I would have ever been able to convince this congregation to go online. I wasn't even convinced of the merits of it, frankly.
Oh, I hear a lot of that from clergy, and some of them are like, you know what, I really like it this way.
Yeah, it's a blast. It's
everybody's going to show up physically, and nobody has to come and leave, and I can still be wearing shorts and nobody will know. They kind of liked it.
Well, and we took, I've watched you over the years in various incarnations in your career, and I realized like we're sneaking into other people's turf a little bit here.
Yeah, you're mowing my lawn. Yeah. Well, but it's interesting because there's the other side of that, the prosperity theology folks like Joel Osteen. I went and did a weekend. I stayed at his mega church in Houston, doing some documentary work. And man, that band was seriously tight. I mean, these were some of the best session players in Houston, and they just sounded great. And he had over 5 services, or I think it was 5 services from Friday night until Sunday afternoon, 35,000 people in total, right? And, the music was intoxicating. And the interesting part was the choir, which was a 100-voice choir, was all community members, was not a professional choir. They had come together as a community. So that was a very nice piece. But I realized that, production value is going to be an issue when it comes to these things. But when you think about it, anyone who thinks that church or temples of any kind are not theater is nuts. They're all theater. I mean, there's even an argument to say, that God is saying, get out of those little buildings where you think I live. Mm-hmm. I live everywhere. I don't live in some nice building with stained glass. I live everywhere. And perhaps we've tried to sort of push everybody into the building. Beautiful part is congregation, is people coming together in a physical sense, which we've all almost forgotten about. But I do find it interesting that production value is being reinvented, because if you go into a Catholic church or a Tibetan monastery, the theater is thick. It's profound. A Hindu temple, the theater is profound. In Judaism, there's a desire for the least amount of glamour in a synagogue sanctuary as possible, because iconography is not well thought of, right?
Right.
So another part I want to talk about is, who in the jazz world do you find has the spiritual content that makes you a happy player? Like what artists do you, because for some people it's, a Love Supreme and John Coltrane, and for others it's more Sublime. Where do you fit in the spectrum of what speaks to you in service of your clergy positioning?
I probably have 2 tracks that I'm often on. One is that sort of ECM track of spacey Nordic, Tord Gustafsson, and some of those contemporary Jacob Bro on guitar. Some of those
EST
guys are just doing right.
EST.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of that stuff is just that's just so obviously that has that austerity. I mean, maybe it comes a little bit out of that Protestant culture in a way. So maybe I'm recognizing something.
The Calvin spoon.
Nothing ostentatious, just minimal here.
No dancing.
But yeah, for sure. But certainly some of that stuff is when we do music and meditation, we're thinking about that sort of sound. I work with a tabla player a lot to try and get ourselves out of some of the conventional sounds, both church sounds and jazz sounds, and just try to get some tabla rhythms going over some old hymns and explore them in new ways. And often thinking
lovely.
About
tabla, to me, is liquid drumming.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
I play hand drums, and the idea of learning how to play tabla, it's like it would take me 5 years to just let go of all my nonsense just to even begin. Right.
The tabla player here is like, every so often I ask him a question about what's going on here. And he's, well, this is going to 13 and this other thing is going to 7. And I'm okay, well, cool, man. Count me in. Just count me in.
That's right. Nod when it's my turn. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's one track.
So the other track would be total Kansas City swing.
Wow.
I really think that's the promise. Like that just gets me into a place. I mean, I mean, that's the idea of that steady, pulsing, swinging, forward motion. That's got all sorts of that carries on into the obviously in the present milieu. But if I'm thinking like iconic kind of things that get me into that zone, and it's that classic swing, a classic medium swing. I can play that all day in church, and I feel I can play it all night in the club, in a bar or a pub or whatever, but play it all day in church, and it lands. It lands for me spiritually. It communicates with audience, congregation, and it gives something. I mean, it gives energy. Well,
to me, it's like that kind of music is one where you find the pocket and you just live there. Like there's no expectation that something else is supposed. It's a be there now kind of music, right?
Absolutely.
Sit in the groove, sit in the pocket, and just whatever's going to happen is going to happen, and it might increase in intensity and then reduce in intensity. But it's still the pocket, and you still return to it all as much as you can. I love that idea.
I had a long, one of my mentors died a couple of years ago now, very famous Canadian pianist named Brian Brown.
Right.
And Brian and I worked together 2-3 times a month for 15 years. And Brian was from that, I don't think he would never call himself part of any school. He was a wonderful contrarian, and loved playing in church. It was we played gigs together, and over the years we played more and more church-based shows. And one of the things he just wanted to swing. Yeah. He just wanted, and it was so elegant and it was so perfect. It was so divine, but it was just lay down that swing, and he was had a lifetime of stories from the Toronto scene and growing up in Montreal and playing in New York. And just one of his lines was, if it's jazz, if it's hard, you're not doing it right. And just somehow
one of the other, Mike Stern on guitar with Richard Bona on vocals, to me, If Only, songs like that are so spiritually grounded for me. I tend to love world kinds of music. I don't know if it's because I'm from North Africa, I'm from 500 years in Morocco, and then before that in Southern Europe and all of that. So I resonate with Arabic sound and Middle Eastern sound in general. But I do like when, I remember once that I was with one of my closest friends, and we were doing some work for the CBC, a couple of weeks of radio over in London. And we went to Ronnie Scott's to listen to some jazz, and Pharoah Saunders was playing.
Oh.
And I thought, this is a true test of whether or not you can listen to someone without trying to make them mean something to you. Just be there and let it take you. And one of the lessons I learned that I occasionally, if I do some jazz radio, I talk to people about, when they go, I don't really like that stuff. I say, pick an instrument in this piece of music and just sit with that instrument through the piece of music. Because then you're not sitting there going, I have expectations, right? Verse, chorus, verse. I have expectations. And instead you can let go. And with Saunders, it was a real meditative practice to just say, I don't need this to make a certain sense for me. I just need to be in it. And by the end of it, my friend and I were both almost in tears because it had been so intense and it was so real, right? And when I think of the religious experience for people, I don't see that with a lot of people anymore. I don't see that there is something that truly moves them. I see people sitting back in their seats, not forward in their seats. And I kind of wonder, do the leaders of faith organizations, there's a courage that's needed to say, we're going to go deeper.
Yep.
Right? Instead of, I'm going to give you what you came for. I'm going to play you the hits and then you can go home. Do you think there's enough courage out there, or do you think the adversity that everyone's facing in their congregations will give them the courage to start leaning into this a little more?
One of the challenges is what's the practice? What's the practice that we can gather around? And I know for us to figure out what we're doing when Pharaoh's playing those sounds, you're practicing music, but you also breath and energy and rhythm, all sorts of things are happening. And we've defaulted to words. And I think that's a huge challenge for us, for the United Church of Canada right now is to get out of our words. And I think we're probably not alone. That idea of finding a practice, because people are, not that jazz is going to save the world, although maybe it will. But the emotional response.
Like, I don't think Michael Bublé is going to save the world, but jazz might save the world.
Right. That's the thing. But when people respond, some of these jazz-based liturgical events, and they have a way of being in a sacred space, their sacred space even. I've done some tour. We did some few tours over the years. Churches in Alberta, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Ontario, Quebec, and we go into people's churches, but we'd be playing swing, and we just let the song go, or we'd be playing something more, not Pharaoh Sander-ish. But people would have a way, have something to respond to that wasn't verbal, and I feel like the best spoken word sermons out there, even if I could come up with that sermon, it doesn't have the power. It doesn't speak to the moment. I don't think. I think we have these buildings, we have the skills, we have the energy. When I do the music and meditation online, we get emotional responses. They're not saying, "Hey, nice tune" or "nice service." They're going, I'm heartbroken and I needed that.
Right.
And in church too, for sure. But part of what church or shul, I think a part of it is the community building.
Absolutely.
I can have a B- sermon, but somebody's done something A+ that day, and there's coffee afterwards.
That's right.
And we've all seen each other, and
Yeah, I've told the story often of a guy who was actually the president of one of the synagogues, and he said to me, "Look, I don't believe in this prayer. Prayer doesn't speak to me at all." I said, "But you have to come every week. You're the president. Like, what are you doing here?" And he said, "I'm not being glib. I come here for kiddush. I come here for the food after. Not for the food, but for the fact that we're all standing together talking, and I'm watching kids grow up and people get old and people come back, and I'm in a community of people, and we're breaking bread. What more could I want?" Right? And that's his prayer right there, right? Like, everyone has a different prayer. Everyone's life is a prayer of some kind or another.
And there's very few organizations left that where you're somewhat randomly selected to be in the room. Like, my kids, when my daughter went off to university, she said, I realized partway through, she went from small town Ontario to McGill, Montreal. She said, I suddenly realized I wasn't around any old people, and I missed it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think,
John Terpstra is a poet here in Hamilton, and he goes to church regularly. And I said, "What is it about it that you love?" And he said that it's not my choice who are in those pews. That there are people that I probably won't like, and people that I really like, but I have to come together with them.
Yep.
And that to me is a worthy social challenge, particularly in an age where we self-select so often. I mean, our social media channels are totally self-selected, and then it become the echo chambers of our values and ethics. So we stop listening to other people. Being someone who's older now, you realize that an elder is someone who's not valued in many ways. We don't call people elders, we call them seniors, and we give them discounts at Shoppers Drug Mart, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're a commodity, but they're
Yep.
a fading commodity because they're not going to buy 4 more cars from you. They're going to buy 1. So, anyway, look over your shoulder at your kid. Maybe he'll buy one of my cars, right? So it's hard to sort of break that nut. Your friend Brian, you played with him for 15 years. When he died, as a clergy, when I would ask, where did he go?
I think he went into the great unknown. When you spoke about Christians and Jews dealing with palliative care, I long for, I cultivate, I suppose, more of that what you described as the Jewish kind of approach of the unknowable God, and I don't think I'm comfortable having conversations where people talk about a more concrete afterlife. It doesn't ring true for me and my loved ones. It doesn't speak to my lived experience. I am thrilled to think I'm that doesn't bring me any more sorrow. I feel good about that. I feel good that there's a great unknown out there, and if it's earth to earth and ashes to ashes and dust to dust, then that's it. That our stories continue in our little fragile ecosystem as long as human beings are telling stories. That there's enough awe and wonder woven into this life, and woven into the revelations from religious traditions. I can. Some Christians wouldn't agree with me. Lots of people wouldn't agree with me, but I certainly think I'm the Jew that we follow didn't speak much about the next world, and when he did, it was deeply metaphorical, and usually it was about a possible kingdom, a temporal, temporal possibilities in this world of God's. An inbreaking of spirit that was happening in first century Palestine and is happening now. So,
yeah. So, is there a creator, or is it doesn't matter? I intuit that there must be something behind this, or because for some people, there is a creator, and for other people, there isn't one. I fall on the side of, I can't help but think there has to be one, just by walking through a forest and just seeing the miracle of this interconnectivity and thinking something's going on here. I have to bend my knee to it. I don't know what it is, but
yep.
Right?
I would agree. I found the world of panentheism to be very appealing. It has helped me come to grips with a language that is identifying a creative force and some guiding energy, but also resisting Santa Claus big time,
Right.
But affirming that the wonder that we see, or the energy, or the expressions of unity that we see in our world, the gestalts, the sort of like the sense of wholeness that I perceive, the meaning I see in the world is real. I don't think it's, simply neurological chemistry. I think, So I certainly go to some thinkers around that. There's a Canadian philosopher that, to my mind, just the name Jan Zwicky, who I just adore her work. In fact, for this conversation, I grabbed this book by Jan Zwicky called The Experience of Meaning. Okay. And that's just her latest. I mean, she's got a body of work. She's now retired, I think, from University of Victoria. Jan Zwicky does a lot of stuff around Gestalt and around meaning. I don't think she has a real religious sensibility. I've corresponded a little bit with her and told her I'm using her as I'm quoting her in sermons, and at no point that doesn't seem to be of great interest. She's a wonderful person to correspond with around philosophy and around that notion that there are meanings external to us. And as soon as I say there are meanings external to me and to you, to my mind, that's God. That's God or holy or there's
that's the pocket.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Yeah. That's where a person can live comfortably, I think. What you said before about some people, some adherents to religions who would give you a real specific architecture to the afterlife. That to me was always the point where I just go, come on. Yeah. I mean, that kind of certainty is not what I need. Yes,
I remember. Sorry, I remember about 20 years ago. Now I was a small town church Bible study, mostly ladies who were 2 generations older than me at that point, probably. And one of the ladies asked me about the virgin birth, and I said, "I don't think so." And she goes, "Oh, thank God."
Yeah. Well, but this is why for me metaphor matters, right? Because each piece of the wisdom teachings of all the religions, one of the things I love about the Baha'i faith is that it's incumbent on you to learn as much as you can about other faiths and other non-faiths. And I think we would all benefit greatly. I've always wanted to do, there's a thing here in Hamilton called Art Crawl. Right. So I always thought, wouldn't it be great to have a spirit crawl where we all go to each other's different places of worship? Because I'm not going to walk into a church for fear that I'm going to do the wrong thing. I'm going to get up when I should have sat down. I'm going to kneel when I should have been sitting. I won't know what song they're doing. I don't know what's going on here. So I'll be just like, you're not from around these parts, are you?
Right.
Yeah, get me out of here. I got to run. So if we could find a way to as I said at the beginning, Reb Zalman says, how do you get it on with God? I mean, that's the question. And if you get it on by Jazz Vespers, that's great. And if you get it on by Bible study group, okay, that's good too. But I do think that a rock concert often has as much spiritual energy going on in it as any really good church service, right?
Yeah, I often say Peter Gabriel, the Sledgehammer tour, remains to this day as one of the best church experiences I ever witnessed. I think he had Yusun Dur on that. Like,
he did.
Absolutely. I played bars and around the Ottawa Valley in Ottawa for 20 years now, at least. And I've done it just because I love to play. But I know, being a clergy person, and I don't wear that on my sleeve at all, but I get to know the bartenders. I end up doing somebody's funeral, or I end up baptizing their kids, or we end up just sitting up late at night. having a drink and talking about this stuff. And that's such a good feeling. It's such a good feeling to be in the zone where the conversation is authentic. People are looking for a conversation. I've been shocked in the course of my career at how the appetite for a conversation about God and the holy is so out there. I used to come up with, like, I introduced myself as a party as, a group facilitator or something way back when. And at some point I realized that when I said minister or pastor or something, people weren't as horrified, or they actually did another thing. Sometimes I'd be in the corner talking about them recovering from their childhood faith, and having a really intense conversation. But it's surprising, and I find in being the minister who happens to also be playing every Friday night at the pub, has always led to better conversations about the holy, as opposed to, the sort of silly, superficial stuff that kind of can come with the turf.
Yeah. Jim and Tammy Faye Baker's kid, Jay Baker.
Yeah.
Very interesting guy. I did a series for Vision TV a few years back called God Bless America, about religion and politics in the States. So I interviewed him in Brooklyn, where he had a church in a bar, Jay Baker, all tattooed, LGBTQ friendly, the whole thing, but a church in a bar at 4:00 on a Sunday, because the people who came had been out partying till 4:00 in the morning on the Saturday. So they, by the time they could crawl out of bed and come, they came, and they were all young people. But he just said, look, I'm going to meet them where they are.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say, look, if you don't show up at 10:00 on Sunday, you missed it. Missed what? Right? If there's no such thing as an appointment, then what are you missing? But on the other hand, I do understand the value of, I do some workshops occasionally on how to create a spiritual toolkit for yourself. And I say, look, spirit is about relationship, right? To yourself, to others, and to the universe, and to the creation. But religion is an attempt at a fitness program. You got to work out, and you got to do it on a regular basis. And if you don't deepen the experience. You just sort of play at the fringes and say, I had a really nice walk in the woods. I feel spiritual, which is fine for the moment, but it's kind of like hallucinogenics. When I was young and I used to take some of them, it was like, wow, I totally get the unity of everything. I am in on the cosmic joke. I am here. And then by the next morning, I feel like crap. And it's all gone away. So you got to have some sustaining method. Just like if you pick up a saxophone once every 18 months, you're only going to stay at a certain level. But if you pick it up and play it and pick it up and play it, you deepen your experience. It's the same thing, I think, with how to get those spiritual muscles to actually move in a person, right?
Yeah, I think having, I think for all of us, and especially as I age, thinking about how I can foster those practices. That toolkit sounds. I'll take one, please. But also, I know one of my teachers, my saxophone teachers, took me back a few years ago, just right down to brass tacks. He's also very much a practicing Tibetan Buddhist, so this was it. I happened to be in. I spent 3 months in Mexico City studying with him. So studying saxophone in Mexico City with a Buddhist, and he basically, we never left the scale of C for 3 months.
Wow!
It was just body, breath, 3 notes. Memorize this. Don't just do that, and I'll see you next week. And I don't think. It was absolutely transformative for my spirituality.
Right.
And it also just grounded my tone on my saxophone in a way that I was, as opposed to sort of hovering here and there on musically. it was like, no, we're here right now. We're right here.
So when you first started doing that, were you thinking, what? Come on, let's
Absolutely.
go on.
Yeah. That, well, like, we're going to be here for 3 months. We're going to do stuff. He said, well, we might get to B flat.
That should be the name of your book. We might get to B flat.
Yeah. And we never did. He had a certain thing. And I mean, I spent 3 months with him. It took me 2 years to do the 12 scales, the 12.
Yeah. Wow. That's fantastic.
Yeah, it was. He'd been doing that same process himself for decades. Apart from also being a monster player in the Mexican jazz scene. Yeah.
Listen, I gotta go. Like, I'm loving talking to you, but
yeah,
if I want this thing on Facebook, I have to apparently stop before it gets to over an hour. So I'm trying to behave myself. Folks, I'm talking to the Reverend Peter Woods, United Church of Canada. Mackay, is that the name of your church?
Yes, it is.
In Ottawa, and saxophone player, clergy member, soulful Kansas City swing kind of guy who occasionally moves over to the Nordic types who are a little more austere. Me, I'm more of a Brian Eno guy. I'll just sit in the tones and move through. It's been a total pleasure speaking with you. I really do appreciate you doing this with me.
Thank you very much, Ralph. It's been a pleasure for me.
Folks, if you're interested in supporting my podcast, go to patreon.com/NTKR and make a donation if you'd like. Listen, subscribe. Please subscribe. It seems to help. And tell other folks about it too. I love doing Not That Kind of Rabbi, and I love being able to meet people like the Reverend Peter Woods. So everybody, you take care of yourselves, and we'll talk to you soon right here on this particular podcast.